Welcome to the 16th episode of the Lebanese Physicians podcast. And today we will be talking about immigration law, especially with the recent match of a lot of foreign medical graduates in the US. Right now, that is the primary thing on their mind at this point is the visas that are needed to come over to the US. Today, we have two guests. We have Ms. Sarah Peterson Stensrud, who is an immigration lawyer and the founder of SPS Immigration Law in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And she has been a very active member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and has been on the board of directors since 2012. She has also lectured extensively nationally and internationally on employment immigration law. And her specialty, actually, one of her major specialties is healthcare law in addition to other employment-based law. And also we have with us Dr. Wasim Abdullah, who is currently a resident and soon to be chief resident at the Indiana University School of Medicine, who himself is a foreign medical graduate and has been through the visa process in the past and will be going through it in the future, I guess, too. So welcome, Sarah, and welcome, Wasim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to leave the floor to you, Wasim, to start asking some questions, and we can direct it from there.
All right, perfect. So I want to first congratulate all the graduates who were able to match, especially the foreign graduates. I know you've been through a lot of studying and the hassle of applying for the match and all that stuff. So congratulations for this big achievement. I have been through the visa process, as Dr. Diab has said, and we thought about doing this podcast to ask questions to somebody who's an expert in immigration law. So I would like to thank Ms. Peterson for giving us, her time and her expertise. So without further delay, I will just start, by the, basic question for people to understand what is a J-1 visa. So a lot of people hear about J-1 visa. So can you please just kind of like in a few words explain what it is?
Right. A J-1 visa is for a really broad variety of intercultural exchange programs, but specifically to physicians. It is there's a specific program for international medical graduates who are seeking to come to the U.S. to do residency and or fellowship subspecialty training.
Thank you. So the question that a lot of people are asking now is, so how do I apply for a J-1 visa? Where do I apply for a J-1 visa? Sometimes, a Lebanese person who lives in Lebanon and did their med school in Lebanon applying to the U.S., that's kind of easy. They know they're going to apply in Lebanon in the U.S. Embassy. But what about if a foreign person is living in Lebanon, did their med school there, and that was their country of last residence? Would that be the place, would Lebanon be the place where they should get their paper and all that stuff to apply for a J-1 visa, or they should go to their country of citizenship to do that?
Right. So ECFMG, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, as we continue, they are the entity that regulates all J-1 clinical physicians in the United States. And ECFMG expects a statement of need, which every J-1 clinical physician has to have, to come from the country of permanent residence if you're living permanently in another country other than your country of nationality. So it really depends on, are you living permanently in a second country? Then the statement of need should come from that country and you should process through that country.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So it has to be a permanent residency and not necessarily just a residency for, let's say, a couple of years. That should
Correct.
not be enough to get the statement of need from that country. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yep. Their ECFMG is really looking for lawful permanent residence, and really that should be on the DS 2019, which is a form that all J-1 clinical physicians receive. So
Exactly.
They really are looking for that permanent tie to a second country.
So I have a specific question for Lebanon, because kind of like the situation is a little bit special. There are the Palestinian refugees or sons and daughters of Palestinian refugees born in Lebanon, lived in Lebanon, do not have the Lebanese citizenship. They basically don't have also permanent residency in the country. So, and at the same time, so it's a little bit complicated for them, because that's the most common two combination. It's going to be either a Palestinian who lives in Lebanon or a Syrian also citizen who lives in Lebanon. Those two cases where there's a war in Syria, and sometimes it's hard for people to go and try to get those statement of needs. Is there any kind of guidance on that subject?
Yeah, so those are going to be very factually specific. And my guess, based on what you just described, is that those two sets of individuals would process through Lebanon, working through ECFMG's protocols. But again, every situation is so unique that each individual is going to have to look at their set of circumstances. And ECFMG is a really good resource for any J1 physician to help you work through this entire process.
All right, so perfect. So basically standing and contacting ECFMG, the J1 sponsorship kind of division, and asking them about your specific case, try to get an answer from them.
Yes.
All right, perfect. And we'll talk a little bit later about like other visas and maybe like other alternatives for people who have like a hard time finding like getting a J1 visa. So there will be a question about that. So also another thing that a lot of people kind of ask about regarding J1 visa is this idea of having a 2-year home requirement. So can you just kind of explain also kind of simply to people what does that mean when they apply for a J1 visa?
Right. So any clinical physician who comes to the United States in J1 status has a 2-year home residence requirement. And that means you have to go home back to your country of nationality, or if you happen to have the country of last residence on your DS 2019, it's that country, but it's only that country to fulfill a 2-year home residence requirement. And that's because the J1 waiver or the J1 program is an intercultural exchange program. So there are options to waive that 2-year home residence requirement, and we'll likely talk about them down the road. But understand, if you enter the United States in J1 status as a clinical physician, you inherently have a 2-year home residence requirement. And that means you are ineligible for H-1B status, the main way physicians work in the United States, and for your green card status. So it's a big deal, but certainly there are many ways to overcome that 2-year home residence requirement should you want to stay in the United States long term.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the waiver for those 2-year home requirements, but kind of also to kind of make it clear for everyone who's going to be listening to this podcast. This is going to be a 2-year home. Doesn't mean you only have to leave the US, but also you have to go and reside in that country where you got your statement of need from. So you can't just like be, a French, got your statement of need from France and you go live in Germany for 2 years and then apply to the US, right? You have to go back to that country that gave you the statement of need.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So that's for people listening. Some people think about, I would go work in Dubai for like 2 years.
Right.
I'm from Turkey. I would go work in Dubai for 2 years and then come to the US again. That's not how it's done if you want to do the 2-year home requirements. Perfect.
Yes, that's a very critical point. Yeah.
So a lot of people are confused about, and that's probably like something special to the US, specific about the difference between a visa and a kind of status. So what is a DS 2019? And how is it different from like just having a J1 visa stamp on your passport?
Right. So a visa is simply a sticker that the US government puts in your passport. And the sticker permits you to present yourself at a port of entry and seek entrance into the United States. So it's a mandatory element of entering the United States, but a visa does nothing more than that. It doesn't give you any sort of legal status. For J1 physicians, you will get a form called DS 2019, and that's really your legal status document. ECFMG, the overseeing organization, will issue that document to you every year. It's good for 1-year increments. And that's really how you prove your legal status for the entire duration of your training in the United States.
All right, perfect. And would that be like the reason why people can stay in the US while having a valid DS 2019, even if their visa has expired? Is that right?
So if your visa expires while you're in the US and you have your valid DS 2019, that means nothing other than the next time you leave the country, you need to renew your visa. I believe right now, I looked it up before the podcast, Lebanon is actually issuing 5-year visas for Lebanese J1 physicians, and they're good for multiple entries. Now that can change, right? That's based on reciprocity between the United States government and Lebanon. But again, depending on the length of your training program, the visa expiration doesn't do anything regarding your ability to remain in the country, but you always have to have a valid DS 2019.
Which has to be renewed on a yearly basis, right?
Correct. ECFMG will renew that working in conjunction with your training program each year.
All right. And for how long can a person stay in the US if they, let's say, receive a valid first DS 2019 in like 2015? So if they change their status, let's say in between also, let's say in 2017, they were research scholars. Then in 2017, they changed their status to alien physician. Would that start the recount from the beginning of how many years they can stay in the US, or it's all combined?
Yeah, good question. So keep in mind that physicians can do up to 5 years as a research scholar, but the government just clarified that if you do more than 3 years, they may not approve the change from a research scholar to a clinical physician. So keep that in mind if you are a physician who's doing the research piece of it now. Also keep in mind, you can never go from clinical physician to research scholar. So you can go from research to clinical, but not the other way. And so research, legally you can have up to 5 years, but really practically it's about 3 years and you should do the transition. And then the clinical J1 can be up to 7 years as long as you're making progress in your specialty or subspecialty training program. And then in exceptional circumstances, they will extend it for an 8th year. And then you really need a statement of need and a statement of exceptional circumstances from your sending government.
And so those years on research scholar will be counted into the 7 years.
No, sorry, just to be clear, they're separate buckets. So,
okay.
So really, I would say practically up to 3 years as a research scholar, and then up to 7 years as a clinical physician. Again, as long as you can only go for as long as your training program permits.
Okay, so if you switch, let's say you were in 2015 a research scholar, 2017 you switch to clinical physician, you still have from 2017 7 extra years to do your training.
Right, as long as it's in a progression, right? Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So that would be like maybe 9 years on like J1 in the US.
Could be, yeah.
Okay, all right, perfect. That's a question that a lot of people ask. There's also one question I got is, what if somebody had a DS, let's say they came to the US on a research scholar and their contract for some reason was done for like 5 years, and they got a DS 2019 for 5 years, but then they decide after 2 years to switch to clinical physician. Would that cause an issue, or like it's just like those extra 3 years will not be counted?
Yeah, I mean, again, so ECFMG will oversee this all. In my experience, ECFMG is pretty amenable to that sort of a switch as long as there's a reason for doing so. But that would be a situation, again, where you would want to reach out to ECFMG, because ECFMG is going to have to get confirmation from the US Department of State.
So what is, and I know that's kind of more specific to the embassy, but what is a SEVIS fee? Because a lot of people get asked about it, and how many times do I have to pay it and all that stuff. So
so there's a lot of government agencies, right? And so when you embark upon this process, you will start working with ECFMG in their system to register you and any dependents that you have. So you'll create that electronic portal. And then ECFMG will work in SEVIS, which is the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System. It's what we use for Js, for F1 students and whatnot. So SEVIS is the program that actually kicks out your DS 2019 every year. And you only have to pay the fee once if you are in the same program. So in other words, Wasim, you gave the example of a research J1 moving into a clinical J1. Those are different programs. And so that would be an instance where you pay SEVIS for the research side of it one time, and then SEVIS fee for the clinical side of it one time. But once you move into the clinical, even though you're renewing your DS 2019s each year, you're not renewing, you only have to pay that SEVIS fee once.
All right. And is that the same even if somebody, let's say, matched into a fellowship and going somewhere else? Would they have to pay a new SEVIS fee, or they can just like rely on that first one that they paid?
That is actually a question. I think it's only one time, but I don't have a concrete answer for that.
All right, perfect. So basically we'll have to also like reach out to ECFMG, kind of make sure that this is,
I guess I never thought about that, but yeah,
thank you.
I don't pay the fees, so I don't.
Good for you, you're lucky. Another question also is, can I moonlight, and meaning like working in the US, extra shifts to make more money while I'm on a J1 visa?
No, you are only authorized to work for your training program. And while your training program may send you to different sites, you're only authorized to work for the training program listed on your DS 2019.
So now another question is regarding other visas. So people hear about other like options to come to the US. I know J1 is kind of the most common one used, but what are other visas that people can train to residency and fellowship in the US? And how are they different from the J1 visa?
Yeah, so as I'm sure everyone is aware, oftentimes you have married couples, and one of them may be in J1. If you happen to be in that situation, the J2 permits a work authorization. So that's a very simple way, clean way to bring the family unit to the United States. But a different option is an H1B visa. And again, that's a professional visa for physicians and any other occupation. H1B is tricky for a couple of different reasons. So I've been doing this a long time. And when I first started out practicing in immigration law up to about 2005, it was a split between programs in terms of whether they would permit residents and fellows to come in J1 or H1B. But because H1B is so much more heavily regulated of a program, it costs more, there's just a lot more to it. More and more programs started forcing their residents and fellows to use the J1 program. So most likely it's going to be up to your program. I think there are very few programs left that actually let the physicians choose. They're going to tell you that you are coming in J1, or they actually let you use H1B. So again, it's up to your program. If you go to a program that permits H1B, remember H1B is limited for 6 years. And as Lebanese citizens, if you are able to extend your H1B status past that point, it would only be for 1 year, and it's a very limited situation when that happens. So if you're doing a residency in internal medicine or one of the primary care fields, you have 3 years in H1B to do the training, and then you have 3 years remaining to go work in your professional job and to go through the green card process. But like Wasim, you told me you're doing chief residency and then you're going on for your ID fellowship, you're going to run out of H1B time. And there may be other solutions for you, but that 6-year H1B limit really hurts a lot of doctors who subspecialize. And then another option is, again, if you're married, if your spouse has H1B, you may be able to get an H4 EAD. And then another option, which is less common, but usually international medical graduates are quite accomplished. You can look at O1, which is for individuals with extraordinary ability. And so that could also be an option that you could talk to with your program in terms of how to get through the residency cycle.
Well, yeah, one thing, just to give my perspective of the H1B, because I came with an H1B visa, and I had that requirement where I did my 3 years of internal medicine, then my 3 years of fellowship, and I had to find a job at the end of my 5th year of training, actually. And then I had an audit and stuff like that. So I had to extend my stay based employment authorization documents. So basically I had another legal way of staying, but then I had to go get my green card in Lebanon because I did not have a status right in the US at that time. So that was one of the downsides of the H1B at the time that I had.
And I think just to kind of build on that, we all know we're living in a world of COVID, and embassies and consulates are shut down, and it's a lot, it's better to remain in this country. And so that 6-year limit really does create a hardship if you are going into subspecialty programs.
Thank you. And obviously now we're going to kind of talk about and ask a few questions about the waiver, because that's, I know that most people who are going to be listening are just starting their residency now and just kind of to figure out how to come to the US now on a J1 or other visa. But also it's good to kind of keep in mind that if you later on decide to stay in the US and you don't want to go back to your home country or country of last residence, you have to do a waiver of that 2-year home requirement. So can you just kind of give us a small, summary of the ways people can receive a waiver for those 2 years and actually stay in the US immediately after training and start working?
Sure. So the most common way is called a CONRAD waiver. Each state has up to 30 numbers it can use each year to issue waivers. And that requires that physicians work in a medically underserved area or provide services to patients coming from a medically underserved area. And you have to work for 3 years full-time in H1B status. So that's the most common ways. But remember when I was talking about how the programs really shifted from doing half and half of H1B and J1s, because there are so many J1 physicians seeking the waivers, the CONRAD programs have become hyper competitive these days. And you really want to start, I would say by the end of your, by your 2nd year, if you're only doing an internal medicine specialty, you really need to be looking at CONRAD waiver programs. Some really great alternatives to Conrad, though, because of that numerical limitation, is the Delta Regional Authority, the DRA, provides waivers. They also have a 3-year service obligation, but they're not limited numerically, and both primary care and specialists can apply. Also, a similar is the Appalachian Regional Commission. Same as the DRA, it's a 3-year service obligation. Both specialists and primary care can apply, not limited numerically. There's an HHS clinical waiver. Again, it has a 3-year service obligation only for primary care, but not limited. And they really expanded the program this year because of COVID. VAs have a similar waiver program, although they're a little trickier, and you should really talk to a lawyer about the VAs because physicians can get hung up. And then 2 really unique waivers, in particular, we were talking to Lebanese physicians. There is a hardship waiver, which requires that you show exceptional hardship to a US citizen spouse and or child. The really nice thing about a hardship waiver, it requires you to have bad facts to get your case approved, but you don't have a 3-year service obligation. So if you have a US spouse or child, and you have reasons to convince the government it would be really hard for you to go back home for 2 years, that could be a really great option. And then also there's a persecution waiver. It's sort of the same as asylum. It's a little, the standards are a little less expansive, but again, it doesn't have a 3-year service obligation. I will also say the most bizarre thing about the hardship and persecution waivers, they're waivers that are based on really, really bad facts, right? That you can't go home for a really compelling reason. You can't change status from J1 to H1B with those programs. You actually have to leave the country and then come back in the country with an H1B visa. So it's a weird sort of dynamic. But if you get any of the other waivers with a 3-year service obligation, you don't need to leave the country. You can change your status directly from J1 at the end of your training program immediately into H1B.
And since you kind of touched a little bit on the J2 visa, let's say a person is married, a person who has a J1 visa married to a person who has now a J2 visa doing residency in the US. And that person on J1 visa received a waiver for the 2-year home requirement and found like a position. Can the J2 person immediately kind of look for a job and kind of switch to that H4 status and start working, or like what's the procedure for those people?
Yeah, so the J2s are covered under the waiver of the J1, so that's good. If the J2 wants to go into H1B status, what the USCIS, our government, has been doing recently in most instances is denying the change of status, because USCIS is taking the position that unless and until the J1 fulfills, the J2 can't change status. It's not legal, it's bizarre, but they're doing that, but they're very inconsistent. So you can still file for a change of status and fingers crossed they'll approve it. And then in terms of H4, you only get the H4 EAD if the H1B is sufficiently far enough along in the green card process, which usually takes a couple of years post-training. So H4 EAD is not something that would likely be immediately available to a spouse.
And what about, let's say, somebody who was on a J1 visa, and let's say they already spent 7 years of training and now they want to continue for an extra year and they didn't apply for that exceptional extension, and they switch to an O1 visa, or let's say start like working on O1 visa. Does that give them a waiver from their 2-year home requirement?
Unfortunately, no. The only thing that gets rid of that 2-year home residence requirement is if you go back to the country listed on your DS 2019 and fulfill the 2 years, or you get a waiver and you comply with whatever terms the waiver has. And similarly, Wasim, another question that I get a lot of the times is, I just married a US citizen. Can I just file for my green card? Not if you have the 2-year home residence requirement. You either need to fulfill it or you need to get a waiver.
All right, and that applies also like to people who win the, visa lottery, like diversity visa lottery and all those stuff. That doesn't give you the right immediately. You'd rather be like somebody without any visa and like living in your home country when you win those, right?
Right. I mean, it's bizarre. The only visa that gets over that 2-year home residence requirement is the U visa, and that's for victims of serious crimes. So, I mean, you can file that away. I've never actually had a physician who was able to use that, but it's the 2-year home residence requirement is a pretty binding obligation. So,
and you mentioned something about Delta zones and the DRA. Can you explain a little bit more what what are those about? Is this like a federal agency or like?
Yeah, so I'll admit I don't know the states off the top of my head. I always just go to their website, but they'll give you a map of all the qualifying areas within the DRA, the Delta Regional Authority. And if you can find an employer in that area, in that map zone, they can file a J1 waiver for you, and then you have your waiver. You have to work for 3 years in that area. And these, Delta Regional, that's a pretty underserved area, but it covers a wide variety of states. So really good options. And DRA and the Appalachian Regional Commission, they recently, in the last couple of years, opened up to specialists, which is also really nice for all of you who are subspecializing.
And one question I get also from people on like O1 visa, let's say somebody again did not file or like try to get a waiver, did not receive it, works on O1 visa. Some people tell them you can go to your home country for like 3 months every year. And if you go to your home country and start like counting those months while you're in your home country, you can like in that meantime receive your waiver. Is that right?
Sure. So the 2 years is cumulative, right? But you have to be physically in the home country. And I had a client years ago who she was in it long term, and remember, O1 is good for 3 years. And then usually it's extended for 1 year increments unless there's been a change to the job. So you're really looking at this long haul if you're just going back to Lebanon for 3 months at a time. So absolutely it's feasible, but you're in the long haul for that one.
It takes a lot of years to
get
cumulative 2 years, right?
Exactly.
Perfect. I mean, those were like kind of the main questions that I had regarding the waiver. I don't know if you have anything to add, or Dr. Diab, if he has any, further
No, I think what you guys discussed was, what you both discussed was great. I think it's important to know what kind of visa you're coming in on at the beginning, because that's going to impact how you're going to be able to stay in the US and apply finally for your green card and subsequent your citizenship status. So the initial visa will impact a lot afterwards. We don't think of that, but that's an important thing.
Yeah, and the final thing I think I would say is that, when you're in your training programs, if you're only doing primary care, I would say, in the beginning or mid of your second year, you really should be looking for jobs and speaking with immigration counsel to make sure that you understand the full panoply of your options. I've been working with physicians my entire career, so about 20 years now, and it's changed tremendously over that 20-year period. So what we're talking about today may be very different in 2 years from now or 5 years from now, when each one of you is going through your waiver process and finishing up your training program. So start early, and you will be thankful.
All right, thank you. Thanks to you both. This was a great discussion, and hopefully it will answer a lot of questions that come up for people. And if anybody has further questions, they can consult, I guess, with SPS Immigration Law or other immigration lawyers to help with their questions afterwards. But hopefully we answered a lot of the questions that people have on their minds at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson.
Bye.
Thank you, Wasim. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you too. Thank you, Dr. Diab.
Thanks.
Thank you.